Welcome to The Growing Band Director, the podcast that dives into topics applying to all of us band directors. My name is Kyle Smith, and joining me is my friend and colleague, Jeff Smith. Together, we discuss many aspects of a school band program, including how to build your concert, jazz, and marching programs, as well as everything else we do as band directors. More importantly, we'll discuss concepts that help us all improve our own programs every day. Always remember the famous quote by Ray Kroc, "When you're green, you're growing, and when you're ripe, you rot." Let's get started. All right, Jeff, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Awesome. So guys, this is our first episode of The Growing Band Director. We're excited to be talking about the jazz band today. We're hoping if you guys like this, that you subscribe to the podcast and send us comments on what you'd like to hear us talk about in future episodes. You know, if you like what you hear, share it with your band director friends or anyone else you would think that they might enjoy it. So Jeff Smith, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a retired high school band director from Norwalk, Connecticut, and I'm taught as a lecturer at Western Connecticut State University and taught for 40 years. And now I'm retired in New Hampshire, and I have the great honor of writing Kyle's band's marching band drill and helping teach there. So, and I conduct a wind ensemble, Stratford Wind Symphony in New Hampshire, and have a great time.
Most importantly, it seems like Jeff, like you know a little bit about everything. So that's why I always love spending time with you. A little bit about myself. My name is Kyle, and Jeff and I are not related, even though we joke that in order to teach in Westbrook, you have to have the last name of Smith, right? Because my wife teaches all the middle school kids at last name of Smith. And anyway, that's a joke here in Westbrook. No, I'm from South Portland, Maine originally, and had Craig Skemmington as a band director. He did a great job teaching us. And then I went to University of New Hampshire, where I had Andy Boysen, and loved that whole experience. And I've been teaching almost 20 years now. So looking forward to starting this whole podcast process. Jeff, today, I think we're talking about teaching the jazz band.
Sounds great.
So I do want to let everybody know our plan is to be fairly fast-paced and just conversational and not very formal through this whole process. There should be a link eventually people can click on with a couple of recommendations of programs of jazz programming, PDFs. A big shout out to Don Zentz, who has a huge list. He lives in the Jacksonville area in Florida and is really amazing with literature and things like that. So at some point when we talk literature, I'll ask you guys to check out that link. Let's start talking about the rhythm section, because Jeff, I am a firm believer that when it comes to a jazz band, the rhythm section, in my view, is like 75% of the work. That if you can get a rhythm section really happening, that it takes care of a lot of the issues within the horn line. And I also feel like as a band director who's a horn player, a lot of us have a steep learning curve when it comes to how to teach rhythm section, right? So my kids, when I'm teaching I teach drums like half the time. That if I can get the drummer to do what we're looking for, then a lot of times the other stuff happens pretty well. So let's talk first about setup. Like if you're sitting on the podium or in front of your jazz band, how do you set up your rhythm section?
Okay, so my rhythm section, I have the drummer making sure the hi-hat is right next to the trombone section.
Yep.
And then off the ride cymbal, I have the upright bass player. And so that the amp is behind the upright bass player and the drummer, so they hear them all the time. Then I have the keyboard over to the right of them, so the keyboard player can see through the keyboard to the bass player and the drummer. And then I have the guitar player in front with his chair slightly angled, but his amp facing out, so he can see the piano player and he can see the drummer a little bit outside his ear. My big concern is I want the
kind of next to the saxophone section.
Yes, a little bit next to the saxophone section or forward, depending on, every time you go to a different place, the stage is a different dimension, creates a little problem. I just want the piano player and the guitar player to see one another because I don't want them to double comps. I want them to trade comps. So I want them to be able to visually communicate when they're trading.
Yeah, I set them up the same way. The only difference I have is I have the bass player typically kind of over the drummer's left shoulder, almost next to the trumpet section, just so the band can hear the bass amp a little bit better. And we talk about putting the bass, behind so they can hear it. I also put it up on a chair. So, so the sound doesn't get covered, and at least 3 or 4 feet behind them, so the bodies don't cover it either. I've actually started turning the treble up a lot on the bass amps too, just so we can hear the especially on the walking bass lines, right? The rhythm.
And I think the biggest problem there too is the pickup. If it's an upright bass player, what kind of pickup they had going into the amp, because that's going to be your biggest problem when you get to a festival, that you've walked from someplace and that pickup gets nudged and you're spending 10 minutes trying to just get that pickup to pick up properly so the kids can hear it. The other thing that I've tried also when I've had problems was that I have a secondary amp that I run a daisy chain cord to another amp to the far side of the band so they could hear the bass player as well.
I've never done that.
So they could feel it a little bit better, especially with a younger group when you're trying to teach them time and getting the jazz feel. So some of them, you know, they're so locked into 1 and 3 that when you throw that 2 and 4 in them, they just need as much help as possible.
And that's a tip as you're teaching drum set, right? Like the 2 and 4 on the hi-hat is always double forte. No matter what the dynamic of the band is, and no matter what the dynamic of the drummer is, that hi-hat is always loud. And at least in a swing pattern, that really helps drive the band.
Well, I learned a lesson years ago from John Mastriani and Haig Shaverdian over at Hall High School. And what they said is for the first month of jazz band, the drummer is allowed to play the hi-hat and the snare drum and nothing else, so that they get used to making sure the 2 and the 4 are where it belongs and little fills here and there, but that the band focuses in their ears to listen for the hi-hat all the time. Yep. And considering how successful the Hall High School jazz program is, whether it be Ellington, Berkeley, what have you, it worked well. It really helped. It did help the drummers, especially the less experienced drummers.
I feel like there's so much to get into regarding the bass players and the piano players and the guitar players about proper techniques to have them function in a big band and what to play and what not to play. Because, you know, sometimes charts are written perfectly. But say, for example, on piano, so much like they're way overwritten and the piano players don't need to play everything that's there. So, you know, I feel like that's going to be a whole other discussion when we actually talk about specifics about, you know, if you're not a piano player, how do you actually learn how to play some jazz piano and help your kids? And how do you learn how to do Freddie Green on guitar? And how do you learn to like teach a bass player who's brand new, right? Starting bass, and they can't read music yet in bass clef, and they don't know how to play a walking bass line. Like, I think that's going to be a deeper discussion, I think, than we're going to be ready for today.
Right. And I think, you know, the thing is teaching a piano player, rarely do you get a piano player that is a jazz player, and teaching them how to simply voice chords so they aren't too complex, so that in the beginning they're successful at what they do.
The main thing that I remember learning after I started teaching was it's just guide tones, right? You're just dealing with like basically the 3rd and the 7th in the left hand. And if you start them there and they start understanding that would be great. You know, I started studying big band scores because they'd write the piano parts. The 3rd and the 7th was always in the left hand, and the right hand notes were all these extra stuff. So then I started learning, well, if that's what they're writing for, then that's what we should use too. And, you know, I'm a firm believer that any teacher who needs to teach jazz band, you know, sit down and learn how to comp the blues on piano, learn how to walk a bass line, a simple one, you know, because like if you can figure out a bass line on the bass, then your kids can probably figure out, you know, something as basic as using the root and the 3rd only, or the root only, or things like that. So, you know, in my situation, I don't usually rely too heavily on private teachers. Obviously, it's really nice when the kids have them, but I try to take it upon myself to be able to kind of teach all the different sections and sit down and actually function on the instrument for the kids with the band.
I was lucky. We were 45 minutes out of New York City. So I had a wealth of, I had Rick Patrone from the Woody Herman Band, who lived about a mile or 2 from the school. And he'd come in and do clinics for me. And Ellen Rowe, who was at UConn, then went to Michigan. Ellen used to come in and do clinics. And she always said to us, when you're getting your initial piano player going, just have go 1, 3, 5, 7. While they're learning, till they get comfortable with the idea of comping and how to comp, and they don't get too busy. But you're right about how some charts are written where it's too busy. And I think the biggest complaint or comment you get when you go to festivals with jazz bands is, why are you double comping in the piano and in the guitar? Can't you come up with a more creative way of dealing with it? And guitar players trying to play every single note their possible little hand can get on, instead of saying, relax, guide tones, guide tones, guide tones.
Right.
And
because you can play the whole B flat blues on what is it, just the third and the fourth string.
Right.
You can just play those two notes up and down, and sit and figure that stuff out. Yeah.
No, I agree with you 100%. If the rhythm section's strong, the band moves forward much faster.
Yeah. So let's talk about the horns now. I think you and I are in agreement as how we set up our horns. So like, again, if you're new to jazz band, like it's saxes and then trombones and then trumpets, right? And the goal is to have the lead players in the middle of the section, front to back, so the alto one and trombone one can listen back to trumpet one, who's like, to me, if trumpet one and drummer are on the same page and the horns are all with trumpet one, then life is good, right? You've kind of done your work. So you have from left to right in the saxophones, tenor one, alto one, tenor two, bari.
Right.
Right. Sometimes you'll see the bari on the other side if it's a really young band and they want the bari player near the bass player. But I think most schools have it over on the right side.
Yeah. As a bari player, I hate being on the right side.
Yeah.
Because I want to know that bass trombone player is sitting right behind me, right, so that we can both work together and listen down the aisle to the hi-hat.
Yeah, you're right. I think the schools to do that put the bass trombone player over too. So it's like kind of all in one area. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then with trombones, usually from left to right, it's 2, 1, 3, 4. Same thing for trumpet, 2, 1, 3, 4. And if there's a fifth player, sometimes that's a little bit different. But the amount of times I see jazz bands and the first player is like all the way on the left, and they just go 1, 2. They just don't, they're not aware. So, and in the warm up process, I think there's so many different ways to do warm ups and things like that with the jazz band, and I always try to get my section listening into the first player, whatever that is. So like if you're playing third trombone, your only job is to listen to the first trombone player. Everybody listen into the section. And then if the lead player can then be following the lead player behind them, that kind of gets everybody on the same page.
And I agree with you 100%, but I also put a lot of responsibility on the lead trumpet player to set the style and the articulation style. And so many hours were spent with the lead trumpet player saying, this is how you do it. But I was fortunate. My kids practiced twice a week for 2 hours each session. And then they had their own sectional on their own once a week, which if they invited me to come to, I would come to. And the rhythm section was pretty cool because for the top band, they'd do 2 sectionals, one by themselves, and then one where they'd invite only soloists to come in and blow over the changes to get used to working together.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, but that I agree. The lead players have to be able to carry that responsibility, and then they need to communicate with one another how they're going to do things.
And here's another thing I've started doing too, when it comes to listening and trying to play stylistically correct, not just with lead trumpet, but with everybody, is having the kids put on earphones and playing along with the pro recording, right? I've even done it where the band plays along with the recording that's blasting through the speakers, right? So like they're playing with the Basie band or the Ellington band or Lincoln Center Jazz Orchestra or whatever group is playing, even if it's the pros that recorded for Alfred, it doesn't matter. Like trying to get into that style. And for I never did that, and then I saw people start doing it. It's like that's just great. It's just the imitation, and just going after what they want to sound like and all that.
I did the same thing, but the only thing I wouldn't do it for the first 2 weeks while we were learning a piece, because I didn't want them to learn by rote. I wanted them to get as much reading time in as possible. But after that, they'd have their, well, pardon my age difference, but they'd have their Walkmans and their headsets, and you'd see them in corners of the band room during free periods with their Walkmans facing the wall, playing the tunes and playing along with it.
Yeah.
We didn't have everything you have now.
Yeah. And it's so funny because I think a lot of people would agree that the biggest issue with jazz students playing jazz is articulation. It's like learning how to articulate, because if you just listen to Clark Terry for 5 hours a day, you'll figure it out. But most people don't listen to Clark Terry 5 hours a day. Jeff, we have never talked about the articulation method of offbeat to onbeat. I don't know if you ever used that or not, but what I was taught is as a way to get kids to swing before they can deal with doodle tonguing, which is a whole other thing that Clark and the pros would use, is when you take a line of eighth notes, you always tongue the onbeat and tongue the offbeat, but it slurs to the next onbeat. So you,
all the time.
yeah. So you tongue the and it would slur to two, and you tongue the and slur to three. So when you do that, you get the accent off the beat. Do da woo da woo da woo da woo. And if you do that and you tongue the note before the rest, I feel like that fixes almost everything. So if you have ba ba do da or whatever it is, if there's a note that's before a rest, always tongue it. And if you can do that on the offbeats, that's the biggest thing. Because I hear all these groups who go and like the notes are right, but it's like they're tonguing. It's like they're playing without using their tongue. They're speaking without using their tongue. There's no clarity in it. So that articulation, like you want to get the kids to listen. And I think you have some great things to say about the listening process, but like the physical, how do I actually get them to sound good right now? Would you have them write things like that in? Like take the pencil.
In the beginning, I did.
Write in.
That was part of our warm-up exercise. We'd go through the cycle of fifths, and the cycle of fifths wouldn't be da 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 da. It'd be ta ta la 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 ta. And they do that, and then we do it as a the dominant seventh scale up and down in fifths and cycle of fifths, and then we do the minor Dorian up and down in fifths. And our warm-ups took only 5 minutes.
Yeah,
because we learned them, and I said to them, you get to a festival, you got 5 minutes to warm up, and then you got to talk about what's going on. So that's what we would do, and then we'd have a different tuning exercises. But the articulation was crucial, and everything you said is exactly what we do. And talking about making notes, how to make a note fatter, and how to make a note tongued properly, using the proper consonants, dit, dat, da, tha, thith, to try to get different feels as you're going along, depending on the pieces. And I agree with you 100%.
Awesome. There was something you said that I wanted to stop, but I didn't, and now I forgot it. Go back. What were you saying? We were talking about articulation.
Talking about the scales and
oh yeah, okay. So real briefly, you talked about the major scale. I think we all understand why doing a major scale. I actually struggle with doing all the scales in the past, because especially when I was doing just our second jazz band, there were so many doublers. The kids who could barely like play the C scale on the saxophone. Like it took me forever just to get them to be able to play all 12. Now, if they were in the band and they knew all their 12 scales, that's a different story, right? But just to kind of recap, you mentioned the major scale, you mentioned the Mixolydian scale. That name is just always so confusing, where we just flat the seventh, right? If it says C7, you flat the seventh note of that. And then the Dorian scale, which is the flat the third and the seventh. So that's for a lot of classical teachers, they think natural minor scale. But in jazz, we don't want to use that. We want to use the major six. So it's just flat 3 and flat 7. And what's cool about that, in case people don't know, is that when you have a chord progression like a 2-5-1, right, which is in all music, say we're in the key of C and it goes D minor, G7, C. Well, all those notes are actually just the C major scale, right? D to D, all naturals, G to G, all naturals, and C to C, all naturals. So if the kids are used to those scales, you can then make the correlation of, look, these 4 measures are really just the C major scale. And the only reason there's a chord progression is to make it interesting for people to listen to.
Correct.
So I think that's where you get those 3 scales from.
Right. And then the other thing we used to do is we used to take, after we did warm up, then the rhythm section would just start comping whatever key I picked, but B flat blues, F blues, whatever. And then we'd just go around the room and everybody would play a chorus real fast. And then if we had time, we'd do a call and response, and one of my more egotistical children would stand up and just blow a 2-bar thing, and then somebody would echo it back and go through. Yeah. But in my case, I had 3 jazz ensembles. Yep. My oldest one, they knew what they were doing by the time they got there. The middle one thought they knew what they were doing. And the younger one definitely knew they didn't have a clue what they were doing. And they knew it was a process going through. And so you taught different levels to everybody to get it so it worked out.
Being able to teach all those levels is really, really big. One thing that I learned in the improvisation, because the biggest thing is people will say, oh, my kids don't want to improvise. To me, we might just do the concert B flat scale. You do it in like half notes up and down to the ninth, and then 4 bars of just rhythm section, right? And I have them playing 2-5-1, like C minor, F, and then B flat major for 2. Mm-hmm. So in those 4 bars in between their scales, I just have kids noodle. So the group improvisation where everybody's improvising as part of the warm-up, they don't feel like they're on the spot. Now, when they get up to a top band or a position where they're comfortable improvising, you don't necessarily have to do that. But I've always liked that group improvisation kind of piece to it to get kids more comfortable with their improvisation.
Yeah. And the way I started with the younger kids was that we do call and response, and the rule would be you can use 2 notes.
Yep.
Can't use more than 2 notes, and you only get 2 bars. And the first kid would say, "I can't do that." I said, "Well, then just hold this note for 2 bars."
Yeah.
And at first you'd hear da, and then the next you hear da 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 da, and then you hear da dee da da dee da da dee. And then you hear a little bit more each week. And as they got comfortable, and there's always those kids that are not going to go beyond the da because it's not part of their psyche yet.
Yeah.
But I had one kid that was that way. Gosh, from freshman year to his end of his junior year, you'd hear da all the time. And then his senior year, he made it into the top band. And all these notes started coming out and said, "Where have you been all my life?" And he said, "Well, I went to this summer camp with John Mastriani, and he let me use 3 notes, and I started having fun." And all of a sudden, he just woke up, and
it reminds me. You talk about call and response. I started using the word call and copy because of a lot of times I play something and I want them to play exactly what's back, whereas response they can play different, right? I remember Clark Terry, for those people who don't know, is like sort of the godfather of jazz, in my opinion, past Louis Armstrong. And being at UNH, we had the blessing of seeing him all the time, and it was amazing. But he always had the phrase that talked about assimilate. What's the second one? Imitate, and then innovate. Those were his 3. So just getting kids to copy you. If you have kids who can't improvise, just you play something, have them copy it. Yeah. And then that sort of gets them going. We talk about, because that's the biggest thing, right? I can't improvise. I don't know what to do. Well, like we don't have kids improvise talking until they listen and copy, right? When kids are babies, they're just trying to copy what they hear, and then they can't really use it for years correctly. Mm-hmm. So I always look at kids as little babies, when it comes to improvisation, and just don't expect them to be able to play right away. Mm-hmm. And that it works really well. All right, why don't we?
And then you got kids who learn to do it a little bit, but never want to take the time and energy to go beyond that and do the listening and the studying to get there. And it's all types of kids.
Right. So let's jump into a little bit of programming, where we talk about different things to use. And to be honest, we have some notes here, but we haven't really planned exactly how we want to say this or whatever. I just do want to have a shout out here again to 3 people who have been huge for programming if people don't know. And again, I hope these links will be available for people to check out if you want. Don Zentz, who's a great programmer. Jeff, have you heard of Don Zentz? Have you seen his?
No, I have not.
So if you just do a quick Google search or click on the thing for the Don Zentz recommended chart, he's got 12 pages or something of just here are great charts at all grade levels for all things. It's just amazing. One of my good friends here in Maine, Tom Lazat, who sort of has taught me a lot about programming, not only for concert band, but for jazz band and marching band and all those things. And probably the greatest arranger I know is Terry White, who's published in the area, also lives in our town. But I mean, he can take anything and make it swing and make it really sound good. And, I guess when we talk about programming, where I would jump off is find music that's at the level that your kids can perform and sound good, and choose it based on them. Right. So let's talk about grade levels. I don't know if you agree with me, but a grade 2 concert band and a grade 2 jazz band are not the same level. To me, the jazz band 1 level is always a grade level harder. So if you have a jazz band full of kids who are playing grade 2, they should play grade 1 jazz band. And I don't know what that is. The biggest thing to me is trombones. You can't buy a trombone chart that doesn't go to high D. But you might not have kids who know any more than 6 notes.
But I've also found out that I stopped looking at grade levels years ago, and I just listened. And then I'd go and look at the chart to see what was the top note in the trumpet. Mm-hmm. I don't want to hear somebody gagging, trying to play a high C or a high D. And then I want to make sure that the trombone is within their capabilities. And then I look at the key signature. I had a friend many years ago from the Chicago area that said, don't buy any jazz charts that have sharps in them. Huh. Well, you can't do that. But it does say that as the kids, it's easier for them to be in flatted keys when they're younger. And as they progress to go into the sharp keys, I don't know if I agree with them, but two of my favorite programmers is John Mastriani, who he's now the associate director of jazz studies at University of Connecticut, but he used to be at Hall High School before that, and ran a summer camp down in Stamford, Connecticut. That was great. And then the other guy that has had a lot of influence on me is Earl Mcdonald, who also is at UConn, but he used to be the arranger and writer for Maynard Ferguson. So and they have some pretty good ideas about arrangements you should do. And they said the same thing that I always said. When you go to play at a festival, you need a swing chart, you need a ballad, you need some kind of Latin tune, and then you need some big heavy hitting hit. If you have the tunes, whatever style you choose, which is the strength of your group. And their comment was that every group needs to learn to play some kind of Latin style. Every group needs to learn to swing, and everybody needs to learn to do a ballad and not try to blow everybody off the edge of the stage, and learn to play with good musicianship, good dynamics, the whole 9 yards. And they said, if you had time, try to get a vocal in there, because backing a vocalist up is so much different than backing up a horn player.
Sure.
And that was the formula that I used whenever I went out anywhere to play. And it seemed to work well.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of people, I mean, from the high school level, we typically have kids who can play some stuff, right? Typically, not always, but typically, depending on what band you're doing or what situation you're in. I'm married to a middle school band director, and I know very frequently, especially as middle school teachers, like, you have kids who can't play the instrument yet, right? So I will make a plug for the Real Easy books. I don't know if you've heard of the Real Easy books. They're they're real books. They came out a little over a decade ago, and they even have a 3-horn edition now, which is like, you can have like 2 harmony parts, and they have a shout chorus, and they have like a little background. They have piano voicings. They have useful scales. They have a bass line. It's like mini charts all in one. It's like we talk about flex band for the band, for concert bands now. It's basically that. So those are published, I think, by Share Music. And those things, like, if you can't find a chart that's easy enough for your band, just pull up a melody, pull up those, add some backgrounds, add a harmony part here and there. And as you would say, bingo bongo, you have a chart, right?
Sure.
So for me, when I'm thinking about levels, I think too many bands don't swing. They don't know, like, they don't put the emphasis on playing tunes. Like, I would rather play too much traditional stuff than not enough traditional stuff. And within that, I think most people try to play a swing chart, but I've seen bands that have 3 tunes and there isn't one beat of swing in the entire thing. And to me, if you're going to a jazz festival, not that jazz is swing, you need to swing, right?
Yep.
I actually do find that one of the hardest styles that are for people to approach is the second line style, because there's so many people will say exactly as you're saying. I mean, you can list 5 legitimate styles, but you're only doing 3 tunes, or maybe the occasional 4. So it's obviously a balance, right? You have to try to not do too much of one thing. But the second line groove, for people who don't know about it, is, from that New Orleans style of street parade. After the funeral, the first line is the sad one, and the second line is the celebration of life. And there's so much great music and history that you can teach through that. And if anybody's looking for a one to start the tune second line, or Joe Avery Blues, Victor Goines arranged that in the Jazz for Young People series. I think that's Hal Leonard. Alfred. Man, it's like a great simple tune that is so fun. So, I struggle because, when I try to program 3 tunes, I have like 43. Oh, yeah. And then you got to pare them down and like, which one is the best and which one's not the best. And that's why I ended up doing like jazz most of the year round. Like in the fall, we'll go like once a week, and in the spring, we might go once a week, and in the winter, maybe twice a week, so that, if most bands get to play, 4 charts or 5 charts or whatever, we're lucky that, we get to like 22, 23, depending on the year. Now, some of them are, maybe not as legitimate because it's for an outdoor event, and maybe you want to entertain people, but, getting out and playing is getting out and playing.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. In the fall, we didn't do it once a week. We did do it twice a week, but we only did it like for a little less than an hour, because they had marching band responsibilities and other responsibilities. And then as the year went on, we increased more, and we read a lot of charts. And we ended the year with a concert with the chamber singers, where we did all not pop tunes, but all jazz tunes.
Yep.
And we do the Cotton Club concept like they do at Berkeley, and we do a lot of the stuff from that. And the audience could come down, and if they wanted to dance while we were playing, they're welcome to come down and dance with us while we're playing along and having a good time.
So there was two things I was thinking about. One, improvisation within the tunes. I am a believer that like for festivals, I try to have no more than maybe 5 or 6 improvisers that are all fairly competent. Whereas through the year, I'm trying to get a lot of kids a chance to improvise and not forcing kids to improvise in front of people if they're not ready to yet. But choosing tunes based on the chord changes. I mean, how many times have I seen a band go up and play and like they're burning on everything? They get to the solo section, the kids can't play the chord changes. It's like they didn't think about what the chords were. To me, I'll be like, I need an up-tempo modal tune, which has like 2 chord changes. If I know I don't have improvisers, or I'll say I want to look for a rhythm changes tune, which is A with the A's basically being in B flat and the bridge going around the circle of fifths. So choosing tunes based on the improvisation, and you can do that in Pepper, right? You just choose blues or put in modal under your search, and you can find tunes like that.
Yeah. What I used to do is quite similar to what you're saying. Is I'd pick my pieces. The first thing I do is look at the solo sections and say, is that within our capability? If it is, fine. If it's not, is it adjustable to make it within our capability?
Correct. Yep.
And if it didn't, if I couldn't do either of those, then I'd say, okay, this might be a piece we're going to use for a learning piece rather than a performing piece. If I thought it was worthwhile to learn, but
and if people don't know how to adjust the chord changes, if they don't know that much, because that's a whole other topic we could get into at some point, but like that, if they don't know how to do that, I would say just reach out to band director friends. You have to know people around you who you're friends with who can help you with that.
There's always got to be somebody within a 10-mile radius that's played a lot of jazz. And if you call them up and say, listen, I need help here. Can you give me a hand?
Yeah.
What do I do here? What do I do? They're more than willing because they want to see jazz continue. Yeah. I find that within the jazz community, there's no holds barred. They want to see the activity continue, and they'll do anything they can to help perpetuate it.
It is the American music.
Oh yeah.
No, that's.
I was lucky for a period of time. The Brecker brothers lived in Norwalk.
Oh my God.
So they would come over and do clinics, and then I had Mulligan Studios around the corner from my high school, and some of my kids were the librarian for Jerry Mulligan, so that he'd come over once in a while when he was feeling like he'd like to come over. And so I had a lot of Frank Foster lived 2 towns over and stuff like that. So I was lucky. I had a lot of mentors that would come in and just talk to the kids, or they'd share a chart. They'd say, hey, Frank would say, hey, Jeff, try Shiny Stockings. Here, I sent it over. It'll be there in 2 days. His arrangement of Shiny. And we'd read it, and then he'd come in and say, yeah, well, that really didn't go too well, did it? And then he'd say, why don't you try doing this, this, and this? And right then and there, in his short period of time there, he'd fix it and get it so it sounded better. And that's the nice thing of proximity to New York City. We had a lot of people that were just lived there because they couldn't afford to live in New York City, but they could afford to live in Norwalk and hop a train and go into the city and play there.
Right. And even, in places like where we live here in Maine, there's obviously great local jazz musicians, but nothing like the New York scene, right? But I mean, YouTube has changed all of it. The kids who want to listen can listen. I mean, there's no problem with that.
Oh yeah. Well, and like you've got Craig just up the street.
Yep.
From you, and then you got Nate down at UNH. So you're all set there with strong people. And then you got that new club that just opened in Portsmouth, Jimmy's, which has different jazz artists coming every weekend from all over the place. So if the kids wanted to go down and listen, they could listen to really some hot West Coast players that come in and just play at Jimmy's and then take off.
I bet you there's, the biggest overarching thing with all this is like, just, if you're a band director who wants to grow and wants to get better, which Jeff and I think you and I both want to continue to get better no matter where we are in our stage of our careers and things like that. Just asking for help, just always looking to get better a little bit every day. And I think there's so many concepts in here that we kind of just like glossed over because we're trying to do like a summary here. If people have anything that they want to hear more about, I suggest you reach out to us and let us know. And then hopefully we can hit some of those more in the future.
Sounds great.
So Jeff, this was number 1. I think anything else that was on your mind that we didn't maybe get to?
Yeah, one quick thing. When you're looking at publishing houses, we all tend to go to J.W. Pepper and we'll look at Alfred and we'll look at Hal Leonard. But if you want to find some really interesting charts, also check out Kendor and Sierra and Marina.
And
You
Walrus.
Yep. Just check out some of these places because there's some really cool charts in all of those houses as well. But sometimes they don't make it to the Pepper list. And I know that's a little bit easier for us to buy from through our purchase orders, but sometimes if we can get outside the purchase order and get some charts from Kendor or Jeff Jarvis chart or John Fedchock chart, that's really cool.
And what's the, is it Northern Colorado as well? Is that UNC Press?
I think it's UNC Press, but I'm not sure. I can't recall.
Yeah, they've got great stuff there too. I mean, there's so much. I mean, now there's so many things out there that are just.
And if you're a Mainer, check out Craig Skeffington's pieces. He's got a ton that are out there now, and they're really good charts.
Of course they are.
And it supports the main cause.
All right. Well, that was fun. Nice to see you, Jeff.
Good to see you. See you next week.